Okay, so let's get started again. Okay, so let me remove this one, say this way. I don't know. Okay, okay, where I'm sharing. Okay, good, good. All right. So sampling method is very key, one of the key part of the and level of the research method. So the reason why would be, so we are using the sample data. So in case we have the population data, which is the total number of the cases in the country, or we may not need to care about the sampling methodology. But usually, so based on the latest level of the data I have, there are a lot, right? 342 million people in the United States, for example, and usually on the $107 per housing unit. So I don't know how many the household in the United States, for example, but it's very, very expensive. So that's why we are having the sample data instead of the population data because it is very, very expensive. So we are trying to make the level of the representativeness. So trying to have the a very similar the structure of the gender and similar structure of the education, for example, and whatever the specific the characteristic of the what our the aim of the goal in the research. So we are trying to have the subset of the population and trying to have the relatively easier to gain the access because we don't have the infinite level of the money. So there are many types of the sampling method, but in terms of the representativeness, this is the quality of the sample with the same or similar characteristic distributed as the population from the which was selected. So population is the total number of the people, and the sample is selected from the population based on the criteria of the sampling method. So we say the population is the population parameter, and we are using the sample statistic. But usually, we do not have the population parameter because these are from the population data. So every 5 years, in the United States, in South Korea, we do collect the census data. But this is about all the people. So all the people in the country, but usually it's very expensive. So we are using the sample statistic from the sample data. And so the value obtained from the sample and generalize the findings to a larger population. So that's why we need to have the representative needs of the population. So without the good quality of the sampling method and the sampling strategy, the sample data will be a biased one because some of the methods will be easier and some of the methods are cheaper and very budget friendly. But usually in many times, they lose the quality as a sample. So that's why. So the example of the biosample would be the research question, impact of the education on the health condition in the United States. So the carrying the books, the heavy books may not directly increase your health condition, but there are some of the ways of the mediation. So as I briefly covered in the previous lecture, maybe 2 weeks ago. So there are many of the three ways of the mediator ways. So for example, the why education, the key of the socioeconomic differentials in health condition. So if you take my medical or sociology class next semester or later, you'd read these articles in the lecture. But there are some of the pathways, such as the education impacts on their levels of the work and economic conditions, and their levels of the social like psychological resources, and their levels of the health lifestyle. So we can see that based on these information and these items on the conditions, education is very helpful to improve the health condition. For example, so let's suppose that you are using the sampling method. You are using the choosing the cases out of the some people. So you are on the take the survey from the professors, for example. So you are going through the on the 연구실's in the building, and then you are collecting data from the professors. So that may not be very nationally the population representative, because usually on the PhD, the professors would have the PhD education, PhD level of education, and they are highly educated. So as you could see, the mediating impact of the education, they are very small portion of the of people in South Korea or in the United States. Or if you just collect the data from the students near you or classroom, so they might be younger and they may have the better health condition sometimes, but in terms of the education in progress, so they may not have the other types of the mediators we covered in the previous lecture slide. So the bias of the sample may not guarantee the quality of the research. So that's why we are using sampling method. So individuals in the classrooms, for example, maybe this is not a very nationally or population representative one, because it has an easy access, but a biased and a non-representative. And that will lead into the limitation of the data. And we cannot argue based on the sample data that we can generalize our finding to the national population level. So to avoid the bias, or we need to have some understanding of the sampling method so that we can have the better quality of the representativeness using the sample data and to generalize our findings to the population level. So there are two major types of the sampling method. Is a known probability sampling method and the probability sampling method. So there are the four types of the unknown probability sampling as the convenience sampling, purposive sampling, snowball sampling, and the quota sampling. So these are all the this is not by the probability. So these are not random. So some parts of the population have no chance of the selection, or the probability of selection cannot be accurately determined. So there are many of the limitations. However, non-probability sampling would be more accessible or more budget-friendly and time-saving. So that's why many of the researchers are using this method. So the first one, convenience sampling. So reliance on the available subject near you, you can access, you are available to see. So you are not following the control over representativeness, though you do not have the guarantee of the representativeness, but you may have the budget friendly and the better accessibility to the subject or the participant in the survey. So usually you are using the convenience sampling for the initial level of the study or the pilot study, which is you are starting to explore about this topic or that regard. For example, so one of the research paper I'm working on, that's acceptability of the death penalty in South Korea. So we can see that based on their political orientation, if they are more right-wing or more conservative, they are more likely to accept or more likely to agree on the death penalty based on their trust level. So this is more about the general understanding of the acceptability of the death penalty in South Korea. But in case you are collecting the sample and in your classroom or your friends living in your dormitory or the near you. So that is the convenience sampling, asking same question to the other student near your dormitory or classroom. The problem is, so you are collecting the sample from that. So the population resembles in that way. The number of African American is here, number of whites are here in the population data or in your the target of the population of the research. But in case you are just collecting the data from the white, so three the white males and maybe seven white woman, and you are not collecting any of the African American. Any problem is the bias of the sample, because even though the number of the African American woman and the African American men are small compared with the non-Hispanic white, so you are not collecting the data. So you are losing the information from them. So bias sample is losing the representativeness of the sample. So there are many of the pros, which is the advantages and the positive aspects. The suitable for the initial stage of the research, easier and cheaper than other sampling method. But the problems are that cannot be attributed to the target population. Maybe there you have the selection bias. Oh, this is the convenience sampling is not recommended for the descriptive and the causal analysis, providing more descriptions and explanations, and do not provide the representative sample. All right. And there is a little bit better way as the purposive sampling. The purposive judgment sampling is the type of the non-probability. This is still not a random choice or based on the probabilities in the selection of the choices. But you have the small subset of the sample or the population based on your purpose and the special interest. So if we are having the two group comparison and the different cases, the excluded individuals in the sample. So this is the way of the method. So the researcher choose the sample based on the why they think it would be appropriate for the study. So if you have the very, very particular groups of the people of your interest with the research, so you are using the proportional sampling based on their characteristic. For example, one of my colleague professor, my senior professor, Dr. Hyunjun Park at the University of Pennsylvania, he tried to recruit those people, ages of the 25 through 39, who are Asian American, who can share their the work experience. So this is not the probability sample because you are not collecting the data based on the random choice of the selection, but they are trying to reach out the people who share the characteristic of their interest. So Korean American in this range and in the sample. So this is very useful if we have a very, very special the group of the interest that might be very useful. And then the Korea University. So you are trying to recruit the patient in the Korea University Hospital. They're trying to see that the medicine was very useful on that the treatment in the medicine was very, very useful. And comparing the time point one, which is the older one, time point two is the older later one. So whether on the effect was very zero, it means that there is no impact. And the impact was not zero, which could be positive or negative aspects. So if the dimension, I mean the distance the treatment effect was zero, it means that there was no effect. There was no effect. There was no difference in the time point one and time point two. It means that wow, the medicine was not very useful because it didn't change anything. But if there was some impact, we are not sure. We are not sure that was positive or that was negative. But anyway, there was not zero. So there was some of the positive or negative aspects or the impact of the medicine. So you are using the patients in the Korea University Hospital because categorizing the people who are the patient in the Korea University. But we cannot generalize our finding to the whole patient in the South Korea because this is not a representative sample. So still, roll cost easier than other complex sampling method in the probability sampling. So no time consuming solo for the explanatory project. The problem is does not provide representative sample. We should have the clear, very, very clear justification of the judgment. Still not require the level of the validity issues. So another one, the third one is the snowball sampling. So from very small snowball, it can be larger and larger and larger. So usually, so this is also the non-probability sampling method where each person interviewed. So you started to interview one people and then ask the suggested additional people. So could you introduce some of the other people you know? So sometimes you may not have the access because that might be very, very confidential and you may not know. So the people who are in your interest of your research. And so, for example, if you are trying to, so as some of you are in the unification of the political unification the department as a major, the suicidal ideation of refugees from North Korea, for example. So you started one interview from a family, and then so you got the trust from them, and they introduced the new family, the three new family members, and they introduced again and again and again and again, and you may have the more a number of the participants in your research. So like us, the snowball started from very small. Very small snowball, and then accumulated, and it got bigger, 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 and then so that would be the snowball sampling. The pro would be used in the secret and the very hidden populations. So because of the privacy issue, their security issue, they may not want to participate in the research, but they start to get bigger, bigger, bigger as the time goes by with the gain the trust. And then the problem is still the risk of the bias and the time consuming to get the trust from the people and does not provide representative sample still. So we cannot have that. So the fourth one, the last one in non-probability sampling is this is type of the non-probability sampling. So this is very important. It has very clear criteria, more complex criteria than other non-probability sampling, but this is still a non-probability sampling. Sample based on the pre-specified characteristic, so that the total sample will have the same distribution of the characteristics assumed it exists. No. Similar to the probability sampling, but has problems. Quota frame must be accurate. If the quota frame has very perfect, 100% perfect criteria representing the population level, they may follow the qualification of the probability sampling. But usually, 100% of the perfect is not possible. Otherwise, the selection of the sample elements may be biased. So if we have the very clear knowledge of the structure of the population, we can use the quota sampling. For example, based on the population and the census data, we know that the composition of the races of each state of the United States. Then we may set up the quota sample criteria. And then we may try to follow the characteristic or formation of the characteristic of the population in that sample. But usually that is not perfect. Why? If we do not know the perfect and the accurate, 100% accurate information of the race composition in each race, we cannot set up the criteria of the quota sampling, right? So without that information, usually we cannot make that. So the problem is, so without accurate knowledge of the population data, no, we cannot make the reliable data in the quota sampling. But still, we have the very good criteria compared with the census and the data selection. This is time and cost efficient relatively than the population data collection. Easy to access relatively. So we need to make sure relatively compared with the probability sampling and the census data collection. But there are many of the cons, the risk of the selection bias, right? So based on the non-probability sampling, we could see that these are easier relatively than the probability sampling that represents data. But in probability sampling, the general sample selected according to the probability theory. So which theory you are using, so that will determine the method you are using. So usually in the general the criteria, these are usually used for the large scale surveys. Sorry. So if all population members were identical in all aspects, there will be no different sampling procedure. However, it's rarely the same. So that's why on the sampling criteria, sampling method or sampling theory will be applied to each method. So there are four types of the probability sampling. Simple random sampling, which is the lowest level of the complexity, the easiest one to access, and the low budget. And systematic sampling, stratified sampling, random sampling, multi-stage cluster sampling. So simple random sampling is a type of the probability sampling. So saying that, okay, so based on the number of the people, so we are having a micro population from our data. So a type of probability sampling is applied, a set of random numbers is generated. So you can use the Excel, for example, and you set up the random number. So based on the random number created, or you are choosing, okay, so you are setting the area of the random number, and you are using them. So, okay, you are choosing 12. So ID 12, come here. ID 97, come here, come here, and then you are choosing 10 out of 100 based on the random information. So when the population is homogeneous, this is very, very useful. But the problem is, so usually this is the reality. So no people, so not the people are the homogeneous. So sleep hours and mental health, so select the 10 participants from the group of the students and the Korea University campus. So you are using some of the so out of 100, so you are choosing the number of your preference. So you like the 12, and then you select the simple. So maybe you can use the Excel to set up the random number. Okay, so 25. Okay, so you are at the random number. So you are choosing the number 23, 20, 39, 52, 25, 92, something. So you are randomly selecting from 100. So you are saying that so equal chance of the selection, the problem is not so for the heterogeneous. If their population has many of the characteristics like a gender, education level, region of the origin, or whatever difference is, these are not very useful. So so minimize the selection bias with the population is homogeneous and simple equal chance of selection. But providing a full list of the population each could be very difficult and impossible. So we are using some one additional dimension, or type of the probability sampling in which every kth unit, so every 5 unit or every 10th unit in the list selected. So you are having more the probability sampling, the method, but a little bit better. All right. So start from any unit between 1 and k, counting every 10th unit, for example. So starting from 1 here. So 1, 2, 10, 12, and then the 12, 11, and 24, 9, so it's every 10th one. So you are selecting one. So out of one. So one, you are choosing one, for example. So based on this graphic, 10, 12, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 60. So you can choose 10 aspects. The 10 individuals out of 100. So it's still reducing the possibility of the error compared with the simple sample selection and the more advanced way than simple random SRS, but still you have still the risk of the bias related to hidden period features. If there is a pattern released by race and education and occupation, residentially people are living in here. Here are the Asian more and more, but they are selected very, very little. So that might lead into the selection bias. So another one is the stratified random sampling. So stratification, the important term is the grounding of the units composing a population into homogeneous groups and strata, and slightly more accurate than simple or random sampling and the previous one as the stratification. So stratify the systematic in the random sample. For example, sort out. So instead of the sorting out by the gender and the race and the gender and the race, you can list up. So this is the white man, a white woman, African American woman, African American man. So after sorting out, select the starting point of the between 1 and k. So maybe if you choose, you are choosing every 10th population. So you are starting from 3 and then 13, 23, 33, 43, 53, 63, blah, blah, blah. And then you are using the stratified random sampling. So it's relatively easier compared with the very complex theories of the sampling method, more accurate than other simpler sampling methods such as SRS or the quota. No. The systematic sampling. However, only available when we have the existing underlying classification to the set of the strata. So I mentioned that, okay, we have the information of everyone and the correct information, but usually this is not very available. Let's go to overlapping when the common members in the different strata, when the strata are distinctly different. So when the strata, I mean the standards, are not very qualified and useful and but not very perfectly accurate, so the quality of the sampling of the stratified random sampling is not guaranteed. So the highest level of the sampling method, the probability sampling method would be multi-stage cluster sampling. The multi-stage sampling in which natural groups are sampled initially within the members of each selected group be double sampled afterward. So there are the more dimension. So stage one, identify blocks of the simple sample. So dividing the blocks and saying that this block and this block in the geographically, these are selected as a sample. And there are the nth. So maybe selecting the every one, so maybe fifth sample and sixth sample, and then in the second space, for each list, select the sample of the household based on the every sixth household that is selected within number five. So you are using many layers of the stratas in the multi-stages in the clusters. So this is not very convenient, but very complex and very highly qualified as the standards to have the more on the qualified of the representatives of the sample. So in multi-stage cluster sampling, we begin with the sample of the clusters and the city blocks, and then every nth element in the household and the geographics the sample of the elements each of the clusters. And maybe in the Sejong city, within the Sejong city or every county, we are choosing some of the geographic area in each county, each dong, each gun, each myeon, and shigun-gu, and then we are going to the household in each area of the district, and then we are choosing every nth of the clusters. So usually utilize the sample in the analysis. The pros would be the suitable when the statistical population is very large and flexible, and you have the very clear criteria of the information. But this is very time and cost consuming, which is very expensive because there are more criteria you are applying. And not suitable for the small population, small number of the clusters. If you do not have the very satisfactory level of the number of the clusters and the large number of the sample in the population, or you may not apply that the criteria and need to accurate current level of the information. So the ethics of the sampling is usually the probability sampling is the collecting their information. So when using the non-probability sample method, research must be careful not to mislead the readers into confusing variations in the whatever topical in the population, not to misleading into the confusing population, the dependent population. All right, so there were two major types of the sampling, non-probability sampling, probability sampling. Usually the non-probability sampling the sampling method are easier, the less time consuming, the budget friendly, but these are having more risks of the bias of the selection compared with the probability sampling. The probability sampling has the random selection or random sampling, simple random sampling, systematic sampling, stratified random sampling, the multi-stage sampling, but these are all relatively more complex and more representative than non-probability sampling, but there is no single perfect method for each and every case. All right, so let's see the example questions. So blah blah sampling occurs when units are selected on the basis of the pre-specified characteristic. So keyword would be the pre-specified a very big special characteristic that they want to choose. Snowball, quota, simple random sampling, the probability, what is that? So simple random sampling, the probability sampling, these are the probability sample one, but it seems the pre-selected based on the pre-qualified characteristics. So they might be more closer to the quota sampling than the snowball sampling. So quota sampling is the answer. Blah blah describes a simple sample whose aggregate characteristic closely approximate the aggregate characteristic of the population. So exclusion probability sampling describes that, equal probability of selection method, representatives. Which one is the best keyword about that? So you heard a lot about the representatives, right? Representatives of that. So that is the answer, the best answer out of number four. Blah blah is the general term for samples selected by probability theory. So non-probability analysis, maybe not. Correlation, not very well covered all in the one. Probability sampling, random selection. So it is a general term for the sample selected by the probability theory. Random selection, probability sampling. Maybe probability sampling is the best one compared with the random selection. Random selection could be possible, but this is not the general term, but more about the very specific criteria. Maybe some of the sampling method could have, right? So, okay. So in case we are in the classroom, maybe we can have the questions and answers format. But as this is the asynchronous format, we can conclude our the alternative lecture in this way. All right. So as we have the reflection of the feedback or your comments of the survey, so I will try to make the very simpler, the easier version of the weekly quiz based on the sampling method. So in maybe this is Friday, this is the October 10th. In next Friday, I mean, when is the next Friday? So we will have the weekly quiz, but that will be easier because that was based on the asynchronous lecture, and I will try to cover on a preview of the midterm, which is scheduled in the following week of the semester. All right, thank you very much for your attention and have a great on the rest of the holiday. Thank you.